federal judge throws insults at a royal guard in open court, but minutes later it's him in handcuffs. What did this soldier say that flipped the courtroom upside down? Stay with us, because what unfolds next is a masterclass in calm courage, quiet strength, and the power of truth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Give this video a like if you believe in standing your ground with dignity, and don't forget to subscribe. There's a twist at the end you won't want to miss. On a crisp autumn morning in downtown Philadelphia, the rhythmic click of dress shoes echoed off the marble courthouse steps. Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker, a tall, broad-shouldered soldier with sharp eyes and a composed demeanor, drew lingering glances from attorneys, jurors, and passers-by alike. Dressed in full ceremonial uniform, scarlet jacket, gleaming brass buttons, polished boots, he looked like something out of a historic painting, but his presence here wasn't ceremonial. Called unexpectedly to testify as a witness in a robbery case he'd witnessed while off duty, Caleb didn't come as a symbol. He came as a citizen doing his duty. Yet, as he entered courtroom 5B in the Eastern District Court, he had no idea the uniform he wore would ignite a confrontation with a man who mistook power for entitlement. What happened next left the entire courtroom breathless. The case began as any other. The defense questioned the first two witnesses with little drama. Lieutenant Whitaker sat silently in the back, waiting for his turn to speak. He was used to being still. He'd spent hours at a time on royal posts without moving a muscle, but this courtroom stillness carried a different weight. Then a change. Judge Raymond Tulliver, 62, with a sharp jawline and sharper opinions, kept glancing up from the bench. At first it seemed like curiosity, but as minutes passed, his expression hardened. When Whitaker rose to testify, the judge interrupted. "You there, in costume?" Judge Tulliver said. "Do you think this is a parade ground? We're not entertaining royalty here." A hush fell over the room. Caleb responded calmly. "Your Honor, this is my service uniform. I'm scheduled for official duty at Independence Hall immediately after these proceedings." But the judge wasn't finished. "Well, maybe you can stand around for photographs there, but in my courtroom, you don't get to play dress-up." The gallery murmured. Even the defendant looked uncomfortable. Still, Caleb held his ground. His voice was steady, respectful. "Sir, I've come to testify as requested. My uniform reflects the discipline and dignity of my post." The judge sneered. "Discipline? You look like a toy soldier. Tell me, do you do anything besides stand still and follow orders?" The insult, delivered with surgical cruelty, struck the gallery like a slap. Judge Tulliver's words hung in the air like a fog, thick with condescension. For a long moment, Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker said nothing. His posture didn't shift. His breathing remained calm. But his silence carried more weight than any angry outburst ever could. "Nothing to say now?" the judge pushed, leaning forward on the bench. "Or is that uniform just for show after all?" A whisper passed through the gallery. Two elderly veterans seated in the back exchanged knowing glances. One of them, his Vietnam-era service pin still proudly displayed on his blazer, began to rise, but his companion gently placed a hand on his arm. This wasn't their fight. Not yet. With deliberate grace, Caleb replied, "Your Honor, I stand here under oath. I have served my country in silence, in combat, and now in peace. I believe we all wear our uniforms differently, sir. Yours is a robe, mine is red." The judge's face darkened. He slammed his gavel down. "That's enough. I find you in contempt of this court." The room erupted in stunned murmurs. "Contempt?" asked the prosecutor, rising hesitantly. "Your Honor, the lieutenant has done nothing inappropriate." Tulliver's voice sharpened. "Are you telling me how to run my courtroom?" "No, Your Honor, but—" "I said enough," the judge barked. And then, without warning, he stood and hurled the gavel in Caleb's direction. Gasps rippled through the room. It was an unthinkable act, But before the gavel could hit the floor, or worse, Caleb caught it midair. The moment froze. A soldier, in ceremonial dress, now holding the weapon of the courtroom in a gloved hand. Then he spoke, softly but firmly. "Your Honor, you've just committed assault on an active duty service member. Under federal law, that's a criminal offense." Everyone, gallery, lawyers, even court security, stood still, processing what had just occurred. Caleb placed the gavel gently on the table beside him. "And under judicial conduct guidelines," he continued, "you've also violated Canon 3, requiring judges to maintain order and dignity. I believe this now goes beyond decorum." You could hear a pin drop. What had started as an insult had just become a scandal. And the soldier they mocked? He was about to take control of the room in a way no one expected. Judge Tulliver's eyes flickered as if waking from a fog of arrogance. The gavel, now resting harmlessly on the side table, felt more like a loaded weapon than a symbol of authority. And it wasn't in his hand anymore. That fact alone had shifted the center of power in the room. Caleb Whitaker didn't move. His calm presence, so firm, so rooted, made the courtroom feel suddenly off balance. It was no longer the judge commanding attention. It was the man in red. The security officers hesitated at the edge of the room, unsure whether to step in. They had never seen anything like this. The clerk whispered something urgently to the senior bailiff, who nodded and stepped away, presumably to make a phone call. And still, Lieutenant Whitaker stood silent. Then one of the veterans in the gallery rose, tall, weathered, a navy pin shining on his lapel. "Your Honor," he said, "I was here. I saw what happened. So did everyone else." The judge looked like he wanted to reply but didn't. Words failed him. Another man stood beside the first. "Colonel James Delaney, U.S. Marine Corps, retired," he said, voice steady. "I will also testify. You threw that gavel, and you dishonored that man with your words." It was no longer just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Finally, Caleb spoke. "Your Honor, I didn't come here for conflict. I came here to bear witness, just like I've done for my country. I don't need recognition, but I won't be belittled either, not for my uniform and not for what it represents." Judge Tulliver leaned forward slowly. His bravado had cracked, the mask had slipped. Now he looked human. He whispered, "Huh, you're a lawyer, aren't you?" Caleb nodded. "Oxford, first-class honors, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I maintain my credentials on active duty." The judge exhaled. The room shifted again. People began to understand. This wasn't a ceremonial figure defending ego. This was a man defending justice, with more restraint, honor, and intelligence than anyone had anticipated. For a judge who had built his legacy on control, humiliation, and intimidation, being confronted by someone whose mere presence undid all of that, it was sobering. Then came the sound of the door creaking open. A woman entered briskly, her black robe flowing behind her. Judge Marilyn Vance, Chief Magistrate of the district. She didn't need to be announced, her reputation did it for her. "Judge Tulliver," she said calmly, "I've received a report of misconduct. You'll step aside while we review the incident." He looked like a man caught in a flood of his own making. There was no fight left in him. As he stepped down from the bench, his power stripped not by force but by principle, the room gave him no applause, only silence. Caleb turned slightly toward the gallery, nodded respectfully to the veterans, and waited. The court was no longer out of control. It had just been reminded of its purpose. As Judge Tulliver was quietly escorted out of the courtroom by security, the emotional charge that had filled the space began to dissolve. But it wasn't relief that settled in, it was something deeper, a collective realization. What had just unfolded wasn't about uniform violations, courtroom decorum, or bruised egos. It was about honor. And the cost of preserving it. Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker remained where he stood. He didn't puff his chest or smile in victory. His posture stayed the same. Upright, composed, still wearing the red of the Queen's Guard, with the same dignity that had carried him through war zones and state ceremonies. Chief Magistrate Vance took the bench and adjusted her glasses. "Lieutenant Whitaker, this court owes you more than an apology," she said with calm conviction. "Your conduct has upheld the very values this courtroom is supposed to stand for: truth, respect, and service." There was a moment of stunned silence before she added, "Would you remain for a few minutes after court adjourns? There's a conversation I believe we need to have." Whitaker gave a single respectful nod. "Yes, Your Honor." That conversation turned out to be far more than a formality. In her chambers, Judge Vance offered him a unique opportunity, a collaborative position as a legal advisor to the judiciary on matters of military protocol and court conduct involving service members. "This isn't just about what happened today," she said. "This is about ensuring it doesn't happen again. We need people like you, not just outside our courts, but within them." Caleb paused, the weight of the offer hitting him. He had always seen himself as a servant of tradition, a guardian of heritage. But maybe his next chapter wasn't about guarding from the outside looking in, but standing inside, making the system better from within. "I'll consider it," he replied carefully, his voice low, honest. "My duty remains with the guard for now, but perhaps this is a call I wasn't expecting to answer." Judge Vance smiled. "Duty takes many forms." As he left the courthouse that day, the veterans who had spoken in his defense waited near the front doors. "You handled yourself well, son," said Colonel Delaney, offering a firm handshake. "Not many people could have done what you just did without raising their voice once." "I didn't have to raise it," Colin replied. "The truth carries its own volume." That night, after returning to his quarters, Caleb hung his uniform as he always did, pressed, precise, perfect. But this time, as he looked at it, he didn't just see tradition. He saw transformation, a quiet call to something greater. In the world of rigid protocol and legal boundaries, he had found space for something rare: humanity. And sometimes that's the highest duty of all. Weeks passed. The incident that unfolded in courtroom 5B had quietly made its way through legal circles and veteran communities alike. News outlets never caught wind of it, at least not directly, but among those who understood the meaning of service, it became a quiet legend, a royal guard standing tall in a courtroom, not with defiance, but with dignity that shattered arrogance. For Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker, life returned to routine, or so it seemed on the surface. He resumed his ceremonial duties outside Independence Hall, his red uniform once again just part of the historic scenery. Tourists snapped photos, children waved. He stood immobile, professional, but something inside him had changed. Each morning, when he adjusted his collar or polished his boots, he wasn't just preparing for tradition. He was preparing to serve in more meaningful ways than ever before. The judge's offer still sat with him, a handwritten letter now tucked inside his footlocker. He hadn't yet responded, not because he doubted it, but because the weight of it demanded time. In quiet moments, Caleb found himself reflecting more often on his journey, on the moments that shaped him, the chaos of Afghanistan, the kids he carried to safety, the times he thought he might not make it back, the way his hand had caught that gavel more out of instinct than decision. What surprised him most was how much strength had come not from the training fields or battlefronts, but from restraint, from knowing when to stand tall and when to speak softly. The courtroom had tested not his rank, but his soul. He began visiting local schools on his days off, at first quietly, then more openly, sharing stories not of war, but of values. Kids listened, captivated not by the uniform, but by the humility in his voice. Parents wrote letters thanking him for teaching their children about integrity. "You taught them that being strong isn't about shouting," one note read. "It's about knowing when to stand still." One afternoon, Judge Vance sent word again, this time not an offer but an invitation. A round-table panel with other veterans and legal professionals to develop clearer guidelines for the treatment of service members in civilian courts. He accepted, and as he took his seat among scholars and retired generals, he didn't wear the red uniform. He wore a suit that's simple, clean, and quiet. Yet somehow his presence still commanded the room, because by now those who knew him understood something vital. It wasn't the uniform that made the man. It was the principles he stood for, whether outside Buckingham Palace, in the middle of a war zone, or behind the witness stand. Caleb Whitaker had grown, not louder, not prouder, but deeper. And that growth had become a quiet legacy, shared not through grand speeches, but through the lives he touched. One calm, firm, and honorable moment at a time. On a cold morning in late December, the wind sweeping through the city carried a bite sharp enough to keep most people indoors. But Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker stood firm at his post outside Independence Hall, unmoved, the same way he had for years. To most tourists passing by, he looked like every other ceremonial guard, a historical fixture, a photograph waiting to happen. But those who recognized him, those who had heard whispers of what had happened inside that courtroom weeks ago, saw something else. They saw a quiet guardian, a man who had stood his ground, not with fists, but with grace. What had begun as a humiliating insult had ended as a national conversation. Veterans across the country shared the story on forums and social media. Legal professionals debated the ethical implications. Quietly, behind the scenes, a review was underway not just of Judge Tulliver's conduct, but of how courtrooms engage with active duty service members. And at the heart of it all was a man who never raised his voice. Caleb didn't ask for justice to be personal. He had simply stood for what was right, trusting that others would see it too. And they did. One morning, as he prepared for another long shift, a letter arrived, official, sealed with the emblem of the Department of Justice. Inside was a formal commendation for exemplary conduct, unwavering dignity, and advancing the principles of justice and respect in civilian-military relations. It wasn't just a recognition, it was a turning point. That night, he sat alone in his modest quarters, rereading the letter beneath the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp. The walls were bare except for a single photo, a younger version of himself holding 2 Afghan children in his arms during an evacuation. He hadn't planned on keeping that photo, but after the courtroom incident, he'd pinned it up to remind himself of where it all began and why every stand mattered. Suddenly his phone buzzed. A message from Judge Vance. "We're finalizing the joint committee. I'd like you to be the veteran liaison. Say the word and the seat is yours." He read it twice, then set the phone down slowly. He knew the decision wasn't just about him, it was about every soldier who had been overlooked, every veteran who had been misunderstood. Accepting the role would mean stepping further from tradition and into transformation. He looked back at the photo, then out the window, where the city lights flickered like stars that had dropped just low enough to touch. With a quiet resolve, he picked up the phone again. "Yes," he replied, "let's build something better." Because sometimes the most powerful changes don't happen with a battle cry. They begin in silence and echo forever. What would you do if someone in power humiliated you in front of a room full of strangers? It's easy to imagine snapping back, walking out, or holding on to the bitterness for years. But Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker chose something different. He chose dignity. He chose restraint. He chose principle over pride. And that choice changed everything. In the face of mockery and insult, by a federal judge no less, Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with emotion. He didn't fall into the trap of defending himself with ego. Instead, he responded with precision, courtesy, and something most of us forget in moments of conflict: inner strength. He understood a truth many people take a lifetime to learn. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is silence. Let's imagine this moment from your perspective. You're standing in that courtroom, you've worn your uniform with pride, you've served your country, enduring dangers and sacrifices. And now, a man in a robe, wielding power, mocks everything you represent. He calls your honor a costume. He calls your medals decoration. Then he throws his gavel at you. What would you do? Yell back? Storm out? Let anger guide your hands? Or would you do what Caleb did, catch the gavel, speak calmly, and stand taller? That's the lesson older generations often carry with quiet pride, the kind of wisdom born from years of experience of knowing that power without character crumbles eventually, that the greatest strength is not in domination, but in discipline. Caleb's story reminds us that real courage doesn't always wear camouflage or medals. Sometimes it wears composure. Sometimes it's a choice to be better when others expect you to be broken. So how do we carry that lesson into our own lives? Maybe it's at the doctor's office when a younger professional dismisses your concerns because of your age. Maybe it's in your community where people overlook your experiences, forgetting you've walked longer roads than they've even imagined. Maybe it's in your family where you're trying to bridge generational gaps with wisdom that doesn't always get heard. In those moments, remember, you don't have to match disrespect with disrespect. You can command a room with grace. You can win the moment with honor, just like Caleb did. Lieutenant Caleb Whitaker may be fictional, but the values he embodied are real. They live in every veteran who ever stood silent through storms, in every grandparent who protected their family without applause, in every senior citizen who taught us, by example, what restraint with purpose looks like. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment when your dignity was challenged, but you chose not to fight with anger? How did it change you? Share your story in the comments below. We read every one. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet strength can be more powerful than any shout, please like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel. We share powerful stories like this every week, designed for you, our senior audience, who know what real strength looks like. On a scale from 1 to 10, how powerful was this story for you? Let us know below, and don't forget to pass it on to someone who needs a reminder that honor still matters.